So here we're going to just kind of go over some of the basic methodologies that are used in the study of the New Testament. You will find more information about these different disciplines and approaches in your reading of De Silva. But here I just want to make sure you have a sketch of what those methodologies are. So we'll begin first of all with what's called the historical grammatical approach. I believe De Silva just refers to it as the historical approach, but this is basically where scholars are trying to understand books in their historical context. So they want to know what's kind of going on at that particular time, how some words, phrases, ideas, concepts would have been understood at the time of the writing. This is where you do your word study. This is where you become interested in political realities, social realities. So the historical grammatical approach really arose at a time when scholars wanted to treat the text or the scriptures not so much as the property of the church and something that are just simply allegorized in order to support church doctrines, but as literature that on its own right and can be understood and appreciated as historical artifacts themselves. So the historical grammatical approach. A criticism that or approach that De Silva doesn't mention, but you should be familiar with, is what's called source criticism. And this is where we attempt to isolate the sources of material used in the construction of text. So, I mean, this happens in both Old Testament and New Testament works. As far as the New Testament is concerned, you see this in such areas like in the construction of Matthew and Luke's gospel. Did they use Mark's gospel? Did they use another source? Materials that are common to both Matthew and Luke. Or in Paul's writings, does Paul sometimes use a hymn? Does Paul cite from other authors or works? And so trying to identify where authors use materials and incorporate that materials into their own work is called source criticism. Form criticism developed to try and kind of isolate material and classify them. Now, a lot of this work has to do with areas within the Gospels. So we might look at a particular what's called a pericope or a unit and call it, well, this is an exorcism story, a miracle story, a confrontation story. This may, some of the categories are the issues of myth, sayings, parables. So trying to classify a particular piece of material and give it a designation, a classification. And then scholars would oftentimes wonder, how is that form in the Gospels or in some other book, how is that similar or dissimilar to that form in other sources? So, for instance, Paul sometimes has what we call household codes, where he gives instructions to women and to men and to slaves and to masters. And there were these household codes in other sources. So how are Paul's household codes similar and dissimilar to that? So that's an example of form criticism. You can look at De Silva for more information. Another important one that's really not mentioned by De Silva, but extremely important, is genre criticism. And in genre criticism, it's kind of like form criticism, but in genre criticism, we're attempting to classify the types of literature, the final form of the different books of the New Testament. So I say books here because even this call a letter a book is a way of describing its genre. Now, we may not really think of a letter as a book. Maybe it's a book in the sense of being put together in some construction. So, but, a letter would be a form. Now, the Gospels are an interesting case because the question is, what is its genre? So different scholars have different theories about the type of genre that the Gospels are. And so when we look at Gospels, we'll talk about the kind of genres, what kind of material it is. The book of Revelation is, called an apocalypse. And so what is this form of apocalyptic literature? Maybe the book of Hebrews is a homily. And so what is a homily? What are the features of a homily? How does Hebrews look like it? In other ways, Hebrews looks like a letter. So, but in other ways, it doesn't look like a letter. So trying to identify the kind of material the final form is really genre criticism. An area of great importance is redaction criticism. We'll look again at De Silva, and he'll give you more details. This is very popular in the Gospels, where there's a theory that Matthew and Luke have access to Mark's Gospel, and they utilize Mark, or they redact Mark in the construction of their own Gospels. And so or they may be redacting another source. So oftentimes there's the idea or theory of Q, or some source that was common to Matthew and Luke. We don't know if this source was written, if this source was oral, or even if this source existed. So, but to try and see if there are some things that are particularly characteristic of the editor. In other words, it's the editor of the material tend to have certain language? Do they tend to like to do certain things? So that's what redaction criticism is, the examination of how material has been redacted. The social scientific criticism is a huge area. Lots of work has been done recently in this area, and that's kind of been influenced by anthropological approaches, and trying to take an examination of the social dynamics that take place within cultures. And so De Silva gives quite a bit of attention to this criticism. You'll see there that there's at least 3 different areas where De Silva wants to illustrate what would be done in a social science critical approach to the New Testament. And so if you'll look at those, you'll get a better sense of this criticism. Another form that De Silva spends quite a bit of time on is rhetorical criticism. So rhetoric has to do with the activity of organizing one's material in order to persuade someone of a position that you hold. So in the ancient world, rhetoric was a key part of the pedagogical experience. And so what we are looking at, and there were books, handbooks that were created to guide students into constructing their arguments, constructing their literature in order to persuade. So the question became, how much are our New Testament authors influenced by the rhetorical theories that existed at that time? And how much do we see the letters moving in a way to be persuasive? Now, this is very popular, of course, like for Paul's writings, like with a book like Romans, and thinking about, has Paul, as he seeks to persuade the Romans to see things as he sees them, does he talk to these people or write to these people who he, many of whom he does not know, and present his arguments in ways that, or structure his arguments in ways that they would recognize as, oh, this is good, this is a good, logical, constructed letter. And so rhetorical criticism begins to examine the way in which a person sought to put together their material in order to lead their audience to adopt their view. Postcolonial or empire criticism is also popular. De Silva mentions this. And so this is just kind of recognizing the world where there are many readers who have been colonized by Western powers. And since Scripture has been kind of the possession of the Western culture, it has had kind of a prerogative in interpreting the Scriptures. So, in other words, the way Westerners have thought about Scriptures and interpreted those Scriptures, oftentimes those interpretations tend to support the way Westerners behave. But those who have been colonized by Westerners, whether we're talking about in India or parts of Africa or maybe in South America, they would read these same texts in a very different way than how Westerners would, and trying to appreciate the way in which those who have been colonized might read in ways that subvert the way that the colonizing powers have read those texts. So empire criticism has to do with recognizing that there was an empire at the time that the New Testament was written, the Roman Empire, and how do these writings interact with the presence of the empire? Do they seek to subvert the empire? Do they seek to accommodate to the empire? Is there a mixture of both? So looking at these letters in kind of these books in kind of a dialogue with the imperial powers at the time is another way in which scholars are currently investigating the New Testament. Canonical criticism is kind of one of the last ones we'll talk about here, and that is a reading of Scripture in light of how the entirety of the Christian canon, both Old and New Testaments, is an interlocking, coherent witness. De Silva doesn't really talk about this, but this has been popular ever since the work of Yale professor Reverend Childs, and this is really kind of responding against the ways in which historical grammatical approaches and other approaches tend to leave the meaning of a text in the past and trying to in its prehistory. So with form criticism, source criticism, redaction criticism, the way in which text came to be. And this is kind of looking at, well, this is the text as it is, and this text belongs to a community, the Christian community. They have been interpreting these texts, and how should these texts be read in light of not just themselves individually, but in light of the entirety of the Old and New Testament as a cohesive type of whole. And so these are methodologies that are currently used in the New Testament, and I invite you again to look at De Silva to get more of the specifics about these.